Have you noticed something extraordinary happening across Africa today? While the world is distracted by the clash between America and China, while Europe drowns in debt and political chaos, Africa is quietly, firmly, and strategically winning the new Cold War. Yes, winning. This isn't a slogan. It's not wishful thinking. It's the undeniable reality that African leaders, soldiers, workers, and thinkers are shaping, a reality that the West desperately tries to ignore but can no longer deny. For decades, Africa was treated as nothing more than a battlefield for foreign empires. From the Cold War of the 20th century to the so-called War on Terror, Africa was used, exploited, and manipulated. But today, Africa is flipping the script, and make no mistake, this new Cold War is not simply about ideology. It's not communism versus capitalism. No, this is a war of sovereignty versus subjugation. It's about who controls Africa's uranium, gold, oil, and rare earth minerals. It's about who sets Africa's future. Foreign corporations in Paris and Washington, or African nations themselves. And the signs are clear. Africa is refusing to be a pawn. It is becoming the chess master. So, let's break this down step by step. In this video, we're going to expose how Africa is turning global rivalries to its advantage, why Western powers are panicking behind closed doors, and how visionary leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are rewriting Africa's destiny in ways the world never expected. Stay with me until the end, because once you see how the pieces fit together, you'll realize the so-called New Cold War isn't being fought in Africa, it's being won by Africa. But first, let's go back to the beginning. During the First Cold War, Africa was carved up by foreign powers like a pie at a dinner table. The US and the Soviet Union armed proxies, installed puppet rulers, and staged coups. Africa's resources fueled Western industries, but the continent itself was left in poverty. We all know the story. From the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in Congo to the overthrow of Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, Africa's true sovereignty was always seen as a threat to global powers. But today's Africa is not yesterday's Africa. This generation of African leaders has studied history. They know how the game was played, and they're refusing to repeat it. Think about it. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré has thrown out French troops and reasserted control over gold and cotton. In Mali, Assimi Goïta ended decades of dependency on Paris. In Niger, even after the coup, the military made it clear uranium will no longer be siphoned off to light up French cities while Nigerian children sit in darkness. For the first time in modern history, Africa is setting the terms. Here's the genius. Africa is no longer forced to pick sides. In the 20th century, it was East versus West. But today, Africa plays both sides on its own terms. Need infrastructure? China is there with loans and railways. Need technology? Russia is offering nuclear power and military partnerships. Need markets? The African Continental Free Trade Area is building a 1.4 billion strong market that doesn't depend on Europe or America. In other words, Africa is becoming the swing player in the world's most important game. The US needs Africa's cobalt for electric cars. China needs Africa's rare earth minerals for its tech industry. Europe needs African gas to keep the lights on. And Africa knows it. That's why leaders are no longer begging for aid. They're demanding partnerships. If you want access to Africa's resources, you come with respect, or you don't come at all. Now here's where it gets even more shocking. While Western media keeps portraying Africa as unstable or chaotic, the real instability is in Washington, Paris, and Brussels. Europe is drowning in energy crises, America is losing influence, and Africa is becoming the most decisive player in global trade and security. But how exactly is Africa turning Western panic into African power? And why are secret memos in Western capitals warning of an unstoppable African sovereignty wave? Stick with me, we'll uncover that right after this. Behind closed doors, Western governments are scrambling. Declassified reports from France, leaked memos from the US, and quiet policy discussions in the EU all reveal the same fear. Africa is slipping away from Western control. Take uranium. For decades, Niger supplied France with up to 30% of its nuclear fuel. That cheap uranium kept French lights on, while Niger remained one of the poorest countries on Earth. But now, Niger is demanding a fair price, and in some cases, refusing to export at all. France is panicking because its nuclear plants could literally shut down. Or consider gold. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea are working to build sovereign gold reserves. Instead of shipping bars to Switzerland or Paris, they're keeping them at home, using gold to back their currencies and strengthen their economies. That means Western central banks lose leverage. And then there's the military factor. France once controlled Africa through military bases and foreign-trained armies. But today, African nations are kicking them out and building regional defense pacts. The alliance of Sahel states, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger now stands as a shield against foreign interference. Western media calls it radical. Africans call it survival. What we're witnessing is not chaos, it's a rebirth. A new spirit of sovereignty is sweeping across the continent, one that doesn't care what Paris, Washington, or London thinks. This is why Ibrahim Traoré is not just popular in Burkina Faso, he's a symbol across Africa. He represents the return of the fearless African leader, the leader who refuses to bow, the leader who reminds us of Sankara, Nkrumah, and Lumumba. And that spirit is contagious. From Senegal to Congo, from South Africa to Ethiopia, ordinary Africans are rising, demanding leaders who serve the people, not foreign masters. This is what the West cannot understand. They keep thinking it's about coups, about instability, about strongmen. No, it's about liberation. It's about Africa finally saying, our land, our resources, our destiny. Now here's the question. If Africa is quietly winning, why isn't the world celebrating it? Why do Western news outlets keep screaming about chaos and threats to democracy? The answer is simple, but explosive. Because for the West, an Africa that wins means a West that loses. Next, we'll dive deep into how Western propaganda machines are trying to cover up Africa's victories and how African nations are building a future that no one can stop. But before we continue, remember, if you're proud to see Africa rising, hit that like button, share this video with others who need to hear the truth, and subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this series. Supporting this channel means supporting the African sovereignty movement. Why is it that every time Africa takes a bold step forward, Western media screams about instability, chaos, or threats to democracy? Think about it. When France, Britain, or America reshuffle their governments, it's called politics. When Africa reshapes its destiny, it's called a crisis. Why? Because the West is terrified of the truth. Africa is no longer bending the knee. Let's expose the game. Every single time an African nation reclaims its resources, ends a foreign military presence, or builds alliances with neighbors, the Western media machine kicks into overdrive. They publish headlines like, "Military juntas plunge Africa into chaos," "Russia and China exploiting Africa," "Africa risks isolation from the global community." But look closely. Who owns these media outlets? Who funds the think tanks pushing these narratives? It's the same governments and corporations that lose billions when Africa says no. When Niger stopped uranium exports, French newspapers painted it as a reckless decision. Reckless for who? Not for the people of Niger, who finally see their wealth being valued. It was reckless only for France, which suddenly faced blackouts. When Burkina Faso expelled French troops, CNN and BBC described it as a security disaster. Disaster for who? Not for Burkina Faso farmers, who no longer watch foreign troops patrol their land. The disaster was for the West, which lost another outpost of control. The truth is simple. African sovereignty is always labeled a crisis by those who profit from African dependency. But here's the twist most people don't realize. The louder the Western propaganda machine screams, the clearer it becomes that Africa is winning, because propaganda is always the weapon of the desperate. What Western media cannot silence is the rise of Africa's own narrative. Across the continent, independent media, grassroots organizations, and young digital creators are telling the real story. And that story is powerful. A story of farmers demanding fair prices. A story of soldiers protecting national sovereignty. A story of leaders who no longer see Europe as a master, but as an equal, or even irrelevant. Take Ibrahim Traoré again. The man barely in his 30s is challenging centuries of French dominance. Western journalists call him radical. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, mothers, elders, and youth call him a patriot. Videos of his speeches go viral, not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa. because his words reflect the pain and dreams of the entire continent. Or consider the alliance of Sahel states. Western newspapers describe it as a fragile military pact, but Africans see it as something historic. 3 nations declaring, if you attack one, you attack all. That is sovereignty in action. This is the new African media war. Western headlines may dominate CNN, but African voices dominate hearts, minds, and digital platforms across the continent. And here's the bigger shock. While Western elites dismiss Africa as backward, it's African countries that are quietly pioneering the economic and security models of the future. From new gold-backed currencies to Pan-African defense pacts, Africa is shaping tomorrow's world. But how exactly are these strategies reshaping global power? And why do Western leaders secretly admit they can't stop it? Let's break it down. Let's be clear. Africa holds the keys to the global economy. Without African cobalt, there are no electric cars in America or Europe. Without African uranium, French nuclear plants go dark. Without African oil and gas, Europe freezes in the winter. Without African rare earth minerals, China's tech dominance crumbles. This is why Africa is winning. For the first time in modern history, African nations are using resources as a weapon, not against their own people, but against global exploitation. In the past, contracts were signed in Paris or London, and Africans had no say. But today, those contracts are being torn up. New deals demand fair shares, local refining, and African ownership. Mali is investing in state-controlled mining ventures. Nigeria's oil workers' unions are threatening strikes that would shake global markets. Zimbabwe has banned raw lithium exports, forcing foreign companies to set up processing plants inside the country. This is sovereignty in action. And here's another irony. Every time the West tries to punish Africa with sanctions, Africa gets stronger. Remember how the US sanctioned Mali and Burkina Faso? It backfired. Those nations deepened ties with each other, built trade routes independent of France, and now cooperate more closely than ever. Sanctions that were meant to isolate them instead pushed them to unite. And unity is the one thing the West fears most. Because when Africa stands divided, outsiders rule. But when Africa stands united, outsiders are powerless. If you're still with me, I know you care about this truth, so take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Every click helps spread Africa's story to the world, and together, we're breaking the walls of silence built by Western propaganda. But it's not just economics. Africa is also quietly winning the military front of the new Cold War. For decades, Western troops dominated the continent, with bases in Djibouti, Niger, Senegal, and beyond. They claimed to be fighting terrorism, but terrorism only grew. Why? Because the goal was never peace, it was control. But today, African nations are changing the equation. Instead of relying on NATO or France, they are forming African-led security alliances. The Sahel states have pledged joint defense. Russia is offering military training and equipment without dictating internal politics. Turkey is supplying drones that African armies actually control. The result? For the first time, Africa is building a defense system that serves Africa, not foreign interests, and the West is panicking because they know when you can defend yourself, you are free. Now here's the final piece of the puzzle. If Africa is using resources as a weapon, if Africa is breaking propaganda chains, and if Africa is building its own defenses, what comes next? The answer may shock you. Because the final stage of Africa's quiet victory is already underway, the rise of a sovereign African economy and a united political voice that could change the balance of world power forever. Now, we'll uncover how Africa is building a future beyond Western control, why the West cannot stop it, and how this quiet victory will echo for generations to come. Africa is no longer waiting for permission. For centuries, the story was always the same. Outsiders dictated the rules, and Africa was expected to obey. But now, the tables have turned. Africa is quietly, powerfully, and strategically building the foundations of its own future. And here's the truth the world doesn't want to hear. This future doesn't need Paris, London, or Washington. It needs Africa, and Africa alone. The biggest battlefield of this new Cold War is not guns or bombs. It's economics. and Africa is shifting the balance. Consider this: the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, is creating the largest trade bloc in the world, with over 1.4 billion people. That's larger than the European Union, larger than North America. For decades, African countries traded more with Europe than with each other, but that's changing. Today, from Lagos to Nairobi, from Dakar to Addis Ababa, trade routes are being reconnected. Roads, railways, and digital payment systems are weaving together a continental economy where African goods serve African markets. This means no more dependency on foreign exports. It means African farmers selling to African cities, African tech powering African companies, African gold and oil fueling African industries. And here's the game changer. Once Africa fully integrates its markets, it will not just be a resource supplier, it will be a manufacturing giant, a tech hub, and the world's youngest and most dynamic labor force. That's why the West is terrified. Because an Africa that trades with itself doesn't need Western aid or Western loans. But here's where the story gets even more explosive. Africa isn't just rejecting Western aid, it's building financial weapons that could undermine the dollar and the euro themselves. How? By creating gold-backed currencies, regional banks, and new trade systems that cut out foreign control. Let's dive into it. One of the most powerful moves Africa is making is reclaiming its gold and using it to back national reserves. In Burkina Faso and Mali, leaders are openly discussing gold-backed currencies to replace the CFA franc, a colonial relic controlled by France. For decades, the CFA franc chained 14 African countries to the French treasury, forcing them to deposit reserves in Paris. But now, that chain is breaking. Imagine the impact: a West African currency backed not by French guarantees, but by African gold. That would mean financial independence, trade without Western interference, and true economic sovereignty. And it's not just theory. Zimbabwe has launched gold-backed digital tokens to stabilize its economy. Ghana is buying oil with gold instead of US dollars. Niger and Mali are exploring regional reserves. Each step weakens the grip of the dollar and the euro. Each step strengthens Africa's independence. And the West knows it. That's why IMF officials and European bankers keep warning of risks and instability. But their warnings are nothing more than fear of losing control. Economics alone isn't enough. True victory requires unity. That's why the African Union is slowly but surely becoming a global force. For the first time in history, Africa has a permanent seat at the G20. That means Africa can influence decisions that once ignored it. But beyond global forums, there's something even more powerful happening. The spirit of Pan-Africanism is coming back. Young Africans, inspired by Sankara and Nkrumah, are demanding leaders who unite rather than divide. The Sahel Alliance is the first taste of this. But imagine this on a continental scale. A unified African army, a shared African currency, a single African passport. For decades, critics said it was impossible. But look around. The impossible is already happening. 30 years ago, who believed French troops could be kicked out? Today, it's reality. 10 years ago, who thought the CFA franc could be replaced? Today, it's being debated in parliaments. The dream of unity is no longer a dream, it's a blueprint. And if you believe in that blueprint, then this is your moment. Hit the like button, share this video with your brothers and sisters across the continent and the diaspora, and make sure you subscribe, because this channel is part of building that movement of unity. Every subscriber is one more voice for African sovereignty. Now let's address the question everyone asks. Can the West stop Africa's rise? The answer is no, and here's why. Demographics. By 2050, Africa will have the largest workforce on Earth. That means innovation, labor, and consumption power that no one can match. Resources. From cobalt to oil, uranium to lithium, Africa holds the keys to 21st century technology and energy. Resilience. After centuries of colonization, slavery, coups, and sanctions, Africa has survived it all. If it survived that, it will survive anything thrown at it now. Shifting allies. Africa doesn't rely on one partner. If the West cuts ties, Africa has China. If China falters, Africa has Russia. If both pull back, Africa has Africa. This multipolar strategy is genius. It means no single power can dominate. It means Africa holds the deciding vote in the global balance. That's why this is not just Africa surviving, it's Africa winning. Let's put it all together. While the world obsesses over Washington versus Beijing, Africa is playing a higher game. It is turning rivalries into opportunities, turning sanctions into strength, and turning propaganda into fuel for unity. It's not loud, it's not flashy, but it is relentless. This is why I call it a quiet victory, because while the West debates in parliaments and think tanks, Africa is already moving, already transforming, already winning. And here's the most beautiful part. This victory doesn't belong to one nation or one leader. It belongs to the people, to the farmers refusing unfair contracts, to the workers striking for better wages, to the soldiers guarding sovereignty, to the youth dreaming bigger than borders. That is Africa's victory. But let me leave you with this thought. If Africa is quietly winning today, what happens when Africa begins to shout its victory tomorrow? Because one day soon, the world will no longer whisper about Africa in secret memos or dismiss it in headlines. One day soon, the world will admit the truth. Africa is not the battlefield of the new Cold War. Africa is the victor. And when that day comes, remember, you saw it coming. So stay tuned, because here on this channel, we'll keep telling the truth the world refuses to tell. Like this video, share it with your community, and subscribe, because together, we are amplifying Africa's voice. This is not the end. This is the beginning of a new chapter. Africa's quiet victory is just the start of Africa's bright future.